Now for closing statements. Mr. Tavaglione, you're first.
Thank you very much. Well, ladies and gentlemen, once again, thank you for the opportunity to be here tonight. This is one thing I wanted to mention. I didn't get to say in my opening remarks, and I'll probably take my 2 minutes, but 44 years I've been married, and our honeymoon was right here at this facility. It was a Holiday Inn back then. And I just want to say thank you. You know, our country is at a crossroads, ladies and gentlemen. We're at a critical period where, and in my view, Washington, D.C., both parties have failed us. They've failed us miserably. And the only way we're going to bring our country back in place is through experience. The experience, the know-how to get things done and bring people together. Number one, I know how to get people together. I know how to bring them together. I know how to get an economy going again and produce jobs. My track record proves it. I know how to create energy. Look at what's happening to our energy system. You're spending $4.40-some at the tank because of one of the reasons is the Keystone Pipeline needs to be approved. We need to allow energy to continue to grow in California and become independent on our nation. And I will take that leadership to Washington, D.C. to ensure that we turn our country around, most importantly, through bipartisan efforts. That is why I'm going. I want to improve and save the future for my 2 grandchildren, your children and grandchildren. That's what this is all about, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thank you, Marcia, and thanks again to all of the community partners who put this event together. This election is about a very important choice. It's about the choice between Riverside common sense values versus Washington Republican ideology. You know, I believe it's common sense to provide tax breaks for the middle class and for small businesses, to ask the wealthy to pay their fair share, and to make sure that we have affordable job training and college access for everyone, especially our veterans. It's common sense that we keep our sacred promise to our seniors. We simply cannot turn Medicare into voucher care. Now, John Tavaglione would like to have us all believe that he's a moderate. But John's actions speak louder than his words. He was no moderate when he raised hundreds of thousands of dollars for George W. Bush, who went then and doubled down on trickle-down economics, and then tried to privatize Social Security. He took thousands of dollars from the right-wing Koch brothers, who don't invest in anything without a guarantee of a return. And how can we believe that he'll stand up to Speaker Boehner or Paul Ryan on Medicare when he couldn't even stand up to his own campaign contributors on Liberty Quarry? I think the choice before you is clear. I will stand up for you. He will empower Washington Republicans. It's been an honor to serve as your community college trustee for 22 years. I've had a long and rewarding career as a public school teacher. This November, I'd be honored to have your vote. Thank you very much and good evening.
You got it! Greetings and welcome to a special edition of Political Empire. We are with the Press Enterprise. I'm Kim Pearsall, and this is my co-host Dan Bernstein, and we just attended the Mark Takano and John Tavaglione debate. They are running for the 41st Congressional District. It's a new district, and it was their first debate, I believe, and it was pretty interesting. Oh, it's the second debate. So we went to this second debate. We heard the talk, and Dan, let's talk a little bit about what some of the highlights were. It seemed like jobs. Jobs was the topic du jour of tonight. It was the topic du jour of the presidential debate, which happened just minutes prior. So it was kind of interesting. Where did you think the two stood?
Well, I think John Tavaglione tried to make the case that he's been around the block a few years. He's a couple of terms in the Board of Supervisors. He's commercial real estate. He knows what it's like to write a check, run a business, and put people to work in public works projects. And he seemed pretty knowledgeable about the nuts and bolts of creating jobs. And And I think Takano sort of dismissed him. I think he just basically said, no matter what you do, John Tavaglione, you could be the Messiah walking into Congress, but you're going to be a Republican Messiah, and that's the big problem. So that's kind of how I think Takano was really running more against the Republican caucus.
The establishment.
That he was really offering specific programs, especially about jobs.
Right, and we were talking about this before, how we were hearing lines that we've heard uttered on the campaign trail. So we heard Romney lines. We heard, especially when John Tavaglione brought up the Dodd-Frank bill, and this was to essentially regulate some of the big banks and essentially go in and say, okay, how did we get in this mess? How can we fix it? And he was talking about how it was constructed in a wrong manner, and that was echoing what Mitt Romney was saying during the presidential debate today. And then, of course, Mark Takano was, I think he mentioned it at least 5 or 6 times. I should have kept a tally, but the doubling down.
Trickle down.
Exactly, yeah. That one was ringing true quite a few times during the debate. And it was interesting, too. They mentioned quite a few jobs and the fact that unemployment has gone down. Of course, Takano took credit for that, or not Takano, but Tavaglione took credit for that, since Riverside County's unemployment rate has gone down from 15% in 2010 to about 13.5% now. But yeah, that would be difficult to pinpoint to any one solution. And then, of course, Takano's rebuttal is that there is still a 12% unemployment rate that's still pretty hefty, and maybe he'll help change things. And now we're going to bring on Imran Gori, who is covering the debate for us this evening. He's going to be writing about it for the print edition as well as the online edition. Imran, thanks so much for joining us today. So, curious, what is your lead? And for everyone who's watching at home, that's the first sentence of the story. What did you get out of the debate tonight?
Well, I think as Dan identified, this was about Mark Takano trying to tie John Tavaglione to what he called a rigid Republican right, while John Tavaglione tried to portray himself as his own man, who will differ with the party leaders on certain subjects, like he identified himself as being pro-choice and in favor of the DREAM Act.
Do you think that it struck me that they were both pretty vocal about how ineffective and disappointing Congress was, yet there seemed to be some fundamental differences between the two candidates as well that might be hard to paper over, even if they're trying to work out compromises.
Right. I think, Takano also tried to portray himself as somebody who would be bipartisan, work across party lines, but he clearly is saying that the Republican right is the problem in Washington, D.C. right now.
There's an interesting moment, and again, going back to the establishment and kind of echoing what Mitt Romney and President Obama have been saying during their campaign, the corporations not being people. There was a specific question from the audience that asked, do you think corporations are people? And I thought it was interesting that John Tavaglione hesitated at first and needed that to be re-clarified. What do you mean by corporations?
Right. He was kind of unfamiliar with that whole, again, coming out of the Romney narrative that corporations are people, and it had to do with the ability and the right now, because of the Supreme Court, of corporations to give unlimited amounts of money to campaign, and they seem to part ways on that issue.
Right. Tavaglione essentially agreed with Romney's position that corporations are people. They're made up of people, while Takano says that corporations are not people and shouldn't have the same rights. They were bringing this up in regards to the issue of campaign finance.
One thing that struck me about this debate, and I think that this is really not a Tea Party district, obviously. It's more really kind of a half and half.
Democrats have a slight edge in registration here.
And I think that it struck me that there's, no matter who they are, although Tavaglione didn't really play the Pelosi card very much, but he could have. But it's one of these things that it doesn't matter who you are, what your experience is locally. Once you get to Washington, you drink whatever Kool-Aid is put in front of you, and that's that.
Right. Essentially, he's saying you're going to fall into lockstep with whatever John Boehner or Paul Ryan wants to do.
Well, and going back to jobs, because that was the big one that kept being echoed throughout the debate. was there any clear solution provided during the entire debate? I know that Takano in his opening statement said that we need to bring global companies to the area, the district, and I think Tavaglione talked about getting out of the way of small business and not having regulation. Did you hear any other examples of how they're going to create jobs, since that seemed to be the big
Right.
focus?
It sounds like Takano was saying we need some programs to help out students, training programs, programs for veterans who are unemployed, while Tavaglione was saying government needs to get out of the way of business, essentially deregulation.
What about, they went against type a little bit, at least Tavaglione did, on the issue of immigration and on the issue of women's rights or the war on women. What struck you about those two issues?
Yeah, I didn't find too many differences between the two on that issue. As far as women's rights, Mark Takano brought up the Lilly Ledbetter Act, I believe it is, a couple of times. I don't know if I heard Tavaglione cite his position on that, but he certainly said that he was pro-choice.
Pro-choice and immigration. He was for immigration reform, total immigration reform, wanted a path to citizenship for these 12 million illegal immigrants, saying there's no way we're going to send them back, and kind of chastised that. How does that play? How is that going to play in a rigid Republican Congress? Is that something?
Yeah, he mentioned that he's, I guess, a supporter, like I said, of the DREAM Act. And I guess one difference I think he tried to bring up with Takano was his support for the E-Verify program, which I think has been, by some immigration rights advocates, has been criticized as not being, some questions about its accuracy or its reliability.
True, and he name dropped our local Congressman Ken Calvert for being the person to introduce E-Verify. Right now it's voluntary. He wants it to be mandatory, which would be pretty interesting if that was instituted.
Correct. And back on jobs, one thing that you were asking specific things that they pointed to get things moving, and Tavaglione did have, Takano was a little vague on this, although he was kind of drawing on his educational background and talking about microloans for students. But I thought Tavaglione did a little stronger job talking about a transportation bill, a 7-year transportation bill, not a 5-year transportation bill. He kind of showed that he sort of had a knowledge of how things work, how they get gummed up in the bureaucracy, and it takes a bridge 15 years to be built with all the regulations that hoops that the people have to jump through.
Well, I wonder how appealing it'll be for people too when he's talking about his background, and they're two very different people when it comes to their backgrounds. You've got the educator and you've got the individual who had been in private industry for about 25 years. Like you pointed out, he signed paychecks. He knows what it means to look at the bottom line and wonder, okay, am I going to be able to afford to hire another person? And he emphasized that, which was kind of interesting, even though now he's certainly on board of supervisors. He's not exactly in private industry at the moment, but he's been there. So I wonder if that'll resonate with voters.
I think he tried to bring up, as a Riverside County supervisor, he has a more varied background on issues than, say, as a RCCD trustee.
Right.
I think one other thing that occurred to me on the elusive issue of Social Security, they were both kind of wishy-washy or vague on that. Tavaglione said he kind of went back to the Reagan mantra of waste, fraud, and abuse, and that was about guaranteeing people that there were billions of waste, but he wasn't specific about any other kind of reform there. And Takano was saying more what he wouldn't do. He wouldn't raise a retirement age, wouldn't allow for a means test, which I believe Romney earlier than I said he would allow for a means test. So it's kind of, there's not a lot of clarity on that issue so far.
And in terms of the housing crisis, I thought it was interesting that both got applause lines for their very different perspectives on that one. One was keep the federal government out of it. That was John Tavallione's take, is just let the private industry do what the private industry does. That will solve the housing crisis. And if we let it just be, it'll solve itself. And yeah, he mentioned that the current administration has allowed foreign investors to come into the county, the specific county, and buy up 500 homes and become absentee owners. I'm personally not familiar with that, and so that was something that jumped out at me. I'm not unaware of that, but he was fearing absentee owners perhaps affecting those neighborhoods, those housing communities, and that's not going to help the housing situation whatsoever. Takano said that's deregulation, that's what got us into this mess in the first place. So two distinct sides both definitely got their applause lines for that, though. Either keep the government out or regulate the industry more, and then, yeah, we'll see how the housing industry,
What did you make of the audience? Did it seem right down the middle, a little more Takano, a little more Tavaglione? I kind of thought there was a bit of a Takano,
I would agree with that. Yeah, there was, despite the admonition by the moderator, Marshall McCorn, to keep applause and comments towards the end, there was quite a bit of that during the debate.
And a few murmurings here and there and whatnot.
A few interruptions.
I thought it was interesting that, in particular, it was the question about military strength. What would you do for military strength? And I think both obviously said that we support our military and whatnot. But John Tavaglione made a point of pointing specifically to his veteran supporters who were in the crowd. None of them stood up, although he did ask them if they wanted to stand up and say hello.
I was hoping they would stand up.
I know. And there was no response. It was crickets. But he did point in particular to those supporters.
Another thing that struck me about Tavaglione, I think you heard this before, was that he, after Takano went after him and said, he's not signing these pledges for whatever. He says, I don't sign pledges. Yet he went after Takano for not signing a pledge to be the Blue Dog. So yeah, he kind of had it both ways on that one.
Right. It was interesting. Well, any closing thoughts, Imran, on how the debate went? I asked you what your lead was, but how are you basically going to sum up the story?
Well, you mentioned earlier that this was their second debate. They had a debate in August that was a little less well attended, and they seemed to have a lot of common ground. Seems that Takano is certainly trying to draw a lot more contrasts between himself and John Tavaglione with this debate.
I think they are trying really hard to convince people that they would be different than what Congress is now. They can work with the other side, they can make compromises. And I think that really is important for people to hear because of the registration in this district. And I think that they'll be judged partly on who the voters think will be best at that, best at working across the aisle.
True. And again, it's an interesting circumstance. It's a brand new district, the 41st. It's representing Riverside, Moreno Valley, Paris, Garuba Valley. Like we talked before, the Democrat to Republican ratio, very slim. So we'll see how this plays out. Thank you for watching our program tonight, and thank you for watching the debate earlier. And thank you, Dan, for assisting, and Imran for appearing on the show. And we'll see you at the next debate and hopefully at the voting booth.